when we talk about political science, we are talking about applying the scientific approach or scientific method to the political world. And that's what we're going to focus on in this class is how can we apply these scientific principles to the social world, to the political world. And so you start off learning the scientific method, which you probably learned like in grade 3 or something, but we're going to go over it again, especially because some people think, okay, I can understand how that works for the natural world, but how can you ever test these sorts of things in the political world? So we're going to go today from a natural world example to the social world to the political world, and actually some research that I've just finished on that issue. All right, so if you hear a purring kitty, it's because she's decided to come join us. All right, so let's just go through the scientific method, looking at an example from the natural world. So let's say we were interested in the research question, which is step 1, does running on the spot for a minute increase heart rate? So the first thing we do before we do anything else is we would do some research to see how other scholars have answered these sorts of questions. So what kind of resources do you think you would seek? Of course, you would go to peer-reviewed journals. That's the best way. And maybe I'll upload a video later about the process of peer review and what that actually means. But you'd look up some journal articles, and we'll do that for the social world and political world. But for the natural world, let's just keep it really simple. I would look up some research and find that heart rate tends to increase when you exercise. Running on the spot is exercising. Scholars have studied this many times. Doctors and health professionals have looked at it. So I would ask and see, okay, has anyone else studied this before? Now, the reason I'm going to ask that question is because the third thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to make a hypothesis. So I'm going to say, what do I predict is going to be my answer based on all of that research that I did? And so in this case, I predict that running on the spot for a minute will increase the heart rate. That's based on the research that I did looking at this particular issue. And I'm going to say, okay, this is my hypothesis. This is what I predict is going to happen. Now, the reason you do this is why you make a hypothesis is because you don't want to start just kind of willy-nilly testing everything without having a reason for it. And we're going to look at that later on in the course, how sometimes what can happen is, sorry, my cat won't stop coming off the computer. Sometimes what will happen is bad scholars, will just keep testing things until they find something that is significant. And we don't want to do that. We want to have a reason because, it's the social world. Sometimes things are related when they're not actually related. So we want to have a good reason why we think that's the case. So, I do some research and I learn about how as you exercise, your muscles need oxygen. So there's more oxygen being pumped all over your body or whatever. So I make my hypothesis, and then the simplest way I could test it is probably to do an experiment. So if we were in the classroom together, what I'd do is I'd split you up into 2 groups. One group would be sitting on their bottoms, doing nothing, and the other group would run on the spot for a minute. Then we'd both test our heart rates. And what would probably happen, I assume, is that the group that had been running on the spot would have a higher heart rate. So essentially we have the group running on the spot, which is the treatment group, the group that we're doing something to. And then the control group is the group that would just be sitting still. That means nothing is being done to them. And in the end, we notice the heart rate is higher for those who were doing something, who received the treatment of running on the spot. So then the job would be to analyze that data. So we would normally compare our results on the board. You'd find that, say the heart rate is how much greater for those who are running on the spot. And then the last thing to do is to communicate the results. So you'd say, okay, well, I can conclude that based on this study, your heart rate does increase if you run on the spot for a minute. The implications might be for health. So if you want to increase your heart rate, then running on the spot might be a good way to do it. I might write a journal article about it. I also might do some public mobilization of that knowledge. And so those are the steps of the scientific method. And you can see pretty easily how it works for the natural world. The question, of course, is how do we apply that then to the social world and to the political world? So let's apply an example to the social world now. So the question would be, can synchronous online learning decrease student attrition? So essentially, I was doing some research about this. I was thinking about something that was very relevant to what we're doing now, and found this phenomenon where people think, at least, that people who take online courses tend to drop out of them in a higher rate than people who are doing face-to-face learning. So now we'll actually go to a journal article on that. And, I might read a number of different journal articles to get a sense. Here's a really good literature review about retention in online courses. And I'd look at some of the reasons. So I would read this and I would see, okay, well, there's motivation because people seem less motivated, so they're not going to be able to, or they're going to decide not to keep up with the work. They might be have technological constraints, so they can't figure out the technology. The instructor might do a really poor job at encouraging and motivating online learners. So there's a whole bunch of different reasons. And then they suggest a few suggestions. So, for example, making an orientation program mandatory, classes structured for collaboration. And then one example is the use of live interaction. So it would appear, at least from this one article, and obviously you'd want to go to many articles and get a sense of what's going on, but according to this article, at least, if you have live interaction, so it's synchronous as opposed to asynchronous, then you're going to have a lower attrition rate. All right, so I go back to my scientific approach, and I would say, okay, so it would appear that if you have live, in-person, or synchronous online learning, student attrition is going to decrease. And we found that because of a bunch, you can look at some of the reasons, because people don't want to leave that social culture that they'll get in an online course. So you can find out different reasons why. And so I'd make the hypothesis then, something along the lines of, and here I can actually type these in. I'll just start typing these in, that synchronous online learning decreases student attrition. And obviously spelled that wrong. Okay, so that would be my hypothesis. One easy way to make hypothesis actually is always just write, I predict that. And that way you can know that you actually have a hypothesis, not just a random statement. If it makes sense, I predict that synchronous online learning, so one factor is going to do something to the second factor. And we're going to talk about that more next week when we talk about causality. Okay, so the second thing is, how could I test it? Well, maybe I could test it by doing an experiment. Let's say we could even do one in this class. We're not going to actually do it, but I could divide you up in two groups. I would have one group that would have synchronous learning, and one group would have asynchronous. I really can't spell that word, can I? There we go. Okay, so I would take a look at the two different groups, and I would test to see at the end of the day how many in each group decided to drop out of the course. So that's what my analysis of data would be. I would have one group, and I would have the second group. I'd see who has the higher rate of staying in the class, or the higher rate of keeping enrolled in this particular class. And let's say I found that there was in fact higher retention in the synchronous class. Then I could say something like, in my communication of the results, okay, well, I found that actually my hypothesis is correct, that synchronous online learning can decrease student attrition. And I would communicate that result maybe by writing an article, but I could also perhaps work with RMC, with the university, to say, like, here's some of the best practices that we should encourage our students to do encourage our faculty to do if we want to keep our students in our courses. So we can encourage more synchronous learning, which is not what we're doing in this class, because for other reasons, we need to do asynchronous just because of time zones and all that kind of stuff. Okay. So that would be an example in the social world. Okay. So now I'm going to give you one final example, and that is from the political world. And in fact, this is from an actual political experiment that I did and was just published. So the question that I had was, does more knowledge about single transferable vote, which is an electoral system, make people more likely to be in favor of it? So what I got this research question because back in 2007, a very long time ago, there was this referendum on electoral reform in Ontario. It wasn't STV, it was a different system. But a lot of people said the reason it failed, the reason people voted no, was because they just didn't understand it. And so essentially, I had actually done some research. You can find an earlier article of mine where I had interviewed these referendum resource officers, and they'd said, yeah, like the biggest problem for me was trying to get people to understand the system. So I made this hypothesis that more knowledge about STV makes people more likely to be in favor of it. And again, you always know it's an actual hypothesis because I could say I predict that more knowledge about STV makes people more likely to be in favor of it. So how did I test it? Well, I actually did run an experiment. So let me show you the full package. So I went to St. Lawrence College and I got a whole bunch of professors to let me into their classes to run a little experiment on their students. So I'm just going to show you two of the packages. It was actually a more complicated experiment than I'm showing you here. But the first package of people, so they got this nice little like ethics form, blah, 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 blah. And then they got asked to read a control text. So this is the control group, essentially the group receiving nothing about single transferable vote. So they got instead a text about Xerox and Google and stuff. So nothing that has anything to do with the electoral system. So we can assume that they aren't going to get any info about the electoral system based on this. And then I asked them a whole bunch of different questions. So socio-demographic questions, political participation questions. But then by the end of the study, if a referendum was held today, how would you vote? And so we asked them, okay, would you vote for single transferable vote, or would you would you vote for first past the post, or do you not know or not have an opinion? So while that group had the control text, there were some other groups that were getting a package about single transferable vote. So again, they have the same intro here. And then they get a text about single transferable vote and how it works. Then they get the exact same survey with the exact same question at the end. If a referendum were held today, well, how would you vote? Okay, so that is how I went about testing it. So now I analyze the data. So let's actually go to the real article. This is the actual article that just came out like weeks ago. And let's just skip along to the data analysis. And I'll put this on the Moodle so you can see an example. So I was interested in the type of information that they got, and they did end up getting it in different grade levels, but that's not important for today. So we have knowledge. I'm looking for the one where it is interest. Okay. So let's just look at just these two groups, the people who got the grade 6 text and the people who got the control text. Ultimately, what had happened is they were getting texts at different reading levels, but you can even just aggregate them together and see people who got the control text versus the people who got the text about STV. And you can see that the people who have no opinion or don't know is much higher with the people here with the control text. So 64% of the people who got this control text or the text about Xerox and Google said that they actually had no opinion. 19% said they would be in favor of STV, and 18% would be in favor of the existing system. So really no difference. Now, at least between these two groups. Now, for those who got the texts about single transferable vote, you can see that the percentage of people who are in favor of single transferable vote goes up considerably. Whereas the people with no opinion actually goes down. So they're actually able to make an opinion because they received information about single transferable vote. And then the whole point of this article actually is to show that actually they understand less if it's not provided in a grade level that they can actually use. But you can read the whole article if you're interested in seeing how an actual experiment is done in the political world, so in political science. So the way I communicated my results was through a journal article. So one of the things that you might hear a lot about is peer-reviewed journal articles, that's the gold standard. So let me tell you a little bit about how this article, or this experiment that I did, got it into the Canadian Journal of Political Science in this case. So after myself and my co-author, Andre Blais, had finished the experiment, we've written it all up, what we did is we sent it to the journal. And what they did is that they sent it out to 2 or 3 reviewers who had no idea who wrote the article. And we had no idea who those reviewers were. And the reason they do that, we call this double blind, because it means that neither set of people knows who the other set is. The reason they do that is to make sure that the person who's doing the reviewing can give a really honest, hard look at the paper without being worried about offending their colleagues. And so they sent back a whole bunch of revisions. We had to do a whack of revisions to this paper. And then they sent it back out to the reviewers, and they suggested a couple more revisions, which we made, and then it was finally accepted in the journal. So the reviewers are essentially the gatekeepers. They're the ones saying, okay, I want to make sure that the science that's getting out, this political science that's getting out there, is correct. So they're going to go through what we did with a fine-tooth comb to make sure that everything makes sense, that everything is written in a way that's understandable, that everything that we did statistically is correct. And that's really important because it means that what you see in a peer-reviewed journal, you know, has been through several layers of review. These reviewers are political scientists just like me. So I do a number of journal reviews every year. And this is the reason why we often say that journals are the gold standards, is because it's been checked by your peers, and it's been checked in a manner that means that you can really speak your mind if something is going wrong without being worried about offending a colleague or someone you like. So I really encourage, later on in the course, you're going to have to write a lit review. So I really encourage you to find these peer-reviewed journals. You can usually tell there's oftentimes libraries will give you an option to just look in peer-reviewed journals. But these are the types of journals, so for example, the Canadian Journal of Political Science, and they have these sorts of articles that we know are not just something somebody posted randomly on the internet. We know that it's been through a rigorous scientific method. And we'll be reading a few more like this during the course.